Now I'm going to mute you again. Sorry.
Muted.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Carrie Brandon. I'm the Executive Editor of English for Oxford University Press. With us we have Tony Mathias, who is the Marketing Manager, and Jamie Burns, who is our Marketing Assistant back in the New York office. And I'm going to be your main moderator for today's event. And we've taken care of sort of the housekeeping tasks of muting, but again, please do raise your little micro hand or chat so that if you have a question, we are going to save time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers with the authors. But our presenters today are Oxford authors Jordynn Jack, you wave, Jordynn, and Rose Guest Pryal on top on your webcam. Jordynn is a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She earned her MA and PhD in Rhetoric and Composition from Penn State in 2005 and has taught at UNC Chapel Hill ever since. She's trained as a technical writer, and her expertise lies in scientific and technical communication, rhetorical theory, composition, and writing in the disciplines. Rose Guest Pryal, rhymes with trial, is an author, lawyer, and former professor with 11 years experience teaching college-level writing. She earned her master's degree in nonfiction writing from Johns Hopkins University, her law degree from UNC Chapel Hill, and her doctorate in rhetoric and composition from UNC Greensboro. Her areas of expertise include creative writing, professional writing, and also writing in the disciplines. She also just signed her first novel, which is very exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the authors. The title of this session is Using Genres to Teach Writing. Take it away, Katie.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Please let me know if you have trouble hearing. I can see the chat box, so you can type in there. Thank you for joining us today, and we really appreciate you coming out to learn about what Jordynn and I feel is a really excellent way to teach composition to undergraduate students. So today's agenda has 3 parts. The first is to discuss the purpose of a college writing course. And the subtitle of this is The Essay Misconception. The second point on our agenda is to discuss the theory of a writing course. And, of course, the theory that we have adopted, Jordynn and I, is genres. And then the third is to talk about boots on the ground approaches to using genres to teach writing, designing genre-based assignments. So first, the purpose of a college writing course, and a phrase that Jordynn and I made up, the essay misconception. So I'm going to ask you to do a little task. Privately, write down the definition of an essay. And this is not a trick question. And be prepared to share. You can just jot something down on a piece of paper. You can humor me and pretend to jot something down on a piece of paper. And I'll ask you to type some answers in the chat box in a minute. So the question, what is the essay anyway? So traditionally, writing courses prepared students to write by teaching essays. Those of us who took courses in the history of teaching writing learned this. So what were we teaching when we taught essays back in the 19-whatevers? So do we have any definitions that people want to share? I see one already, a collection of thoughts. Anybody else want to share your definition of an essay? I'm looking in the chat box. Let's be brave. I'll wait one more moment. Okay, so I've done this before. I've asked people, what's an essay? And I've gotten all sorts of things. An essay is a collection of arguments. It's a reflection. It's all sorts of really interesting things, but unfortunately none of those things fall under the definition of an essay. The definition of an essay is simply a short piece of writing on a particular subject, very broad definition. If that's the definition of an essay, what is the pedagogical purpose of writing essays in a college writing course? Well, let's find out. Jordynn, do you want to take this part?
Sure. We've been doing research here at our university about what exactly students are composing across the disciplines. And I know this is a study that's been carried out elsewhere. In our case, what we found is that most college students do not write essays outside of humanities courses. So once they're in a social science course or a natural sciences course, they're more likely to be writing other kinds of things, reports of various kinds, literature reviews, conference papers, mostly either writing that academics would write in their own careers, grant proposals, things like that, or things that they might later on if they pursue a career in that field. So there's a much wider range of genres that students compose outside of our classes. And the question we've been thinking about as we've been working on this idea of genres is, does teaching essays really help students to transfer their knowledge to these other kinds of genres that they're learning later on? And you can see results of our study at the Genre Project website that we've listed below, genre.web.unc.edu. And if you're going to be in Tampa for 4Ps, we're giving a presentation on Thursday at 12:15 p.m. about the results of our study. Okay, so Katie?
So I actually just found where you guys had typed these really awesome answers to my question in the questions box, which seems like a logical place for you guys to type them. Structured collections of thoughts and claims, a way to communicate our thoughts and ideas put together in an organized way. Somebody had a really good one, which I completely agree with, writing without any real rhetorical situation. Yay, Kate. This idea of going back to Montaigne, essays as attempts. So you guys had really great answers, actually. I just couldn't see them the first time I looked. I apologize. But yes. Let's continue. So this is the idea that this idea of the essay without a very strong rhetorical situation. So one way to approach what people are writing at universities is to look at what professors are writing. What are anthropologists writing, psychologists, historians, literature scholars, education scholars, things like that. So our students come to us from across the campus in composition, and then they leave us and go, to their respective majors. And then professors in those respective majors are asking our students to write things that are documents, genres, that those fields expect people in those fields to write. So, for example, in an anthropology course, someone might write field notes, use those field notes to write, say, an ethnography, something like that. Psychologists write all sorts of things. Historians, literature scholars write literary analyses. Education scholars write classroom observations. All of these people probably write grants. So you can see that if you take a look, if you turn the lens from the student to the teacher, you can get a better sense of, within the academy, the kind of genres that the students might be asked to write. So that's one way to discover what it is that maybe we should ask our students to write. So academics in the academy are not writing the essay as part of their jobs. So if we're not writing the essay, what should we teach? So what kinds of writing will your students write after they leave your classroom? And then a more complex question, after they leave college. And the answer is they write real genres, not fake classroom genres. And so what I mean by fake classroom genres, what Jordynn and I mean by that, we can talk about later in this session. And as a preview, student investment in your class will shoot way up. We have seen that in our own teaching. Once you make this shift, because they start to see why you're asking them to do what they're doing. Okay, Jordynn?
Okay, so in this section we're going to talk about the theory of a writing course, and we're going to do kind of a little bit of a retrospective and then focus a little bit more on genre as one theory that we find especially useful for our own teaching. Okay, slide down, Katie. Thank you. Okay, so really quick, what is a genre? We might say that a genre is a document type. So one way that we know something is a genre is if we have a name for it, like complaint letter or product review or affidavit. Those are all genres, and part of the reason why we know is because they have specific labels. And any one of these genres, the reason why it's recognizable is because there's somewhat predictable convention. We know that these can shift, and they depend in part upon the rhetorical situation. But for the most part, you know one when you see one because the conventions are relatively similar. So for example, if you get a stack of resumes on your desk, you know they're resumes almost just at a glance because you expect certain kinds of features like a name at the top and different kinds of headings for education experience. And the reason why these regularities occur is because genres emerge out of recurring rhetorical situations. So someone needs to get a job. That's a common rhetorical situation. There is a genre that has emerged, the resume, that fulfills that rhetorical situation. So again, we're not talking about genres just as a format or a template that students fill out. They're more complex than that. They change over time, and they depend in part on the rhetorical situation that you're in. So within the genre of, say, a resume, you still have a lot of different rhetorical choices to make depending on who you are, what kind of job you're applying for, and so on. So another way of thinking about it is the genre is a problem space that you introduce it to, and it has some constraints, but within those constraints, they can still they make rhetorical choices in order to fulfill whatever the purpose of that genre is. So get a job. So that's me. Next slide. Okay, so we have another small task for you, and if you can use the chat box, I think that's the easiest way. So I'd like you to write down an answer to this question, and there's no wrong answers here. So we'd like to see what other theories have people used in their writing courses in the past. And these don't have to be theories that you currently subscribe to, or they could be. But what are some of the theories that have informed composition pedagogy during your time as a teacher of writing? Now, I can't see the question box that Katie saw, so Katie, if you see some pop up, could you read those out?
I will do that. And I will say, if you guys don't have access to the chat box, just go with the question box.
Yeah, use whatever you can. I think we all see something a little bit different here. Okay, we'll take one more minute. Maybe there's a delay here, too.
I think I'm seeing them in the, yep, they're coming up in the question box. Okay. That's fine. Yep, that's just fine. Use the question box. Moving on.
Did you have any come up?
Mm-hmm. They're coming up.
Yeah, read them out.
Okay. So current traditional expressivism. The question was, I'll go back. What theories have you used in your writing courses in the past, and you don't, or currently? It doesn't have to be what you're using now, but it can be. So I've seen formalist analysis, reader response, feminist pedagogy, expressivism, and I'm just sort of reading as they pop up. So okay. Keep those coming. That's exactly what we're talking about. So, yes.
Okay. So let's take a look at some of the theories that have been most influential in the past. And of course, there are many. We can't cover them all here. Our point in reviewing these is to show that genre theory is not necessarily opposed to any of these foundational theories, but it supplements them in an interesting way. So process pedagogy obviously has shaped how I think the majority of us teach. If anyone's not teaching using a process approach, I'd be surprised. So it's becoming common for all of us to use pre-writing and drafting and revision exercises and editing, and to help students develop strategies that they can use throughout from start to finish when they're composing documents. So this is well accepted, and if you're teaching with genres, you wouldn't do anything different in that sense. So in my classes, I still have students pre-write and draft and revise and edit. The only difference is that we spend a little bit more time up front, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, thinking about the genre that they're writing as part of their pre-writing activity. And we refer back to it actually throughout the process. So we're always looking back to our rhetorical situation and to a specific genre that they're composing, but we're still doing a process-based approach. Okay, next one. So another example would be modes pedagogy, which breaks writing down into certain patterns that recur across different situations. Sometimes there might be 6, sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 7, but roughly these might include things like evaluation or narration or exposition or description. These are all, I guess you could call them strategies that writers use. Commonly when modes are taught, these strategies become types of essays. So you might assign a descriptive essay or an evaluation essay or a narrative essay. So that's another common approach that I think is still used today. Let's go to the next slide. We like to think of genres as, or modes as pre-genres, you could say. So if you're doing some writing that's primarily descriptive, if you think about what real-world context would there be where you'd be describing something, then you can see, well, I might be writing a profile article and use that term to encompass not just a description of a person, but it could be a profile of a place or a profile of a particular event of some kind, a lobster festival, for example. In the same way, an expository essay is might be similar to a news report. So that's one genre in which people report on information. An evaluation essay, if you think, again, what real-world context might there be for writing an evaluation? Well, it's probably a review of some kind, and there's many different kinds of reviews. So it could be a film review, a book review, a performance review. So if you're working for a company, you might have to complete a performance review for someone. Or a narrative essay could be something like an investigative article, or it could be a personal genre like a memoir. And those are all real-world cases where these modes would appear. So we see our genre approach as building on modes and just taking it a step further and thinking about when are modes actually used in genres in the real world. Okay, let's move on.
Okay.
So we already shared our theories, so I think we jumped ahead a little bit. Do we want some feedback for people on why they selected some particular theories? What works about, say, process theory or some of the other ones, feminist pedagogy that people have mentioned? Or should we keep going?
Oh, how are we doing on time? 12:20. Let's keep going, and we can come back to discussing theories at the end in the Q&A. I think is the best approach here. Okay.
Okay. So keep that in the back of your mind. So yeah, I think it would be worth thinking about, say, if you do feminist pedagogy, what would it mean to also incorporate genres in a feminist composition?
Right.
Okay. Next step. Okay. So Katie and I believe firmly that genres are one of the best theories that we have currently. And that's not to say that new theories won't come along, and I'm really interested in following the conversation on teaching for transfer that's emerging in our field. But for now, there's some things that we really like about genres. So one is that always just ground a genre in a rhetorical situation. So in how writing works, textbooks produce, we have these 3 questions. What is it? Who reads it? What's it for? And these are all that students can use to investigate a new genre. If a genre is real, you get great student investment. So just as an example of that, one assignment that we've used a lot at UNC is a grant proposal. And we have students actually look for grants that they can apply to through our university. And then they write a grant proposal. They're not always ready to submit it right away, but we've had students go on to do some more research over the summer, rewrite, submit a grant proposal, and get funding for summer research. So that's an example of a real genre. And we think it's really clear to students when they write something like that how it would actually work later in their academic career. Okay, so as I think I mentioned the transfer conversation that's happening in our field, genre seems to fit into this transfer question. So one of the big problems with students being able to transfer what they learn in first year composition is that students aren't necessarily writing genres in first year composition that seem familiar to what we encounter later in their other courses. There's a mismatch between, say, an essay and a conference paper assignment that they get later on, or a policy report that they're asked to write for an environmental science course. So the technique that we've developed is not necessarily focused just on genres, but helping students to learn how to write unfamiliar genres. So we want students to build some meta-level skills that will allow them to take any genre they don't know, figure out who reads it, who writes it, what it's for, and how to compose it, so that anytime they're faced with a new writing situation, they'll have tools that they can use. Okay, next slide. Okay.
So the last part of this talk is how to take all of these ideas and put them into practice, which of course is the only way this works. So here are some questions when Jordynn and I talked about teaching with genres at, say, 4Cs and other professional conferences and things. Questions we get from people who want to use genre pedagogy but need some ideas about how to start. And the first question we get is this: are there easier genres to start with my students? And so how do you tell if a genre is easy? And it has to do with three factors: student familiarity with the genre itself, the complexity of the genre's conventions, and the pernicketiness of your audience. So let's look at each of these in turn. The student familiarity with the genre. So if your students have written the genre before, the genre will be easier to write. They're familiar with it. That seems pretty obvious. In the book, we call these everyday genres. Text messages, Facebook posts, things like that, stuff they might do a lot. Even a grocery list can be a genre. If it's something that you write in response to a recurring rhetorical situation, this is something that is a genre. The challenge with teaching everyday genres, though, is creating critical distance. How can you get your students to see familiar genres as genres? But that can be part of the fun with teaching or starting with an everyday genre. You can take something that is familiar and then make it unfamiliar. So the next the next aspect or factor that makes a genre hard or easy is how complex the conventions are. So genres grow in complexity, or we could say difficulty, based on the complexity of their conventions. Sometimes this correlates to the length of the genre, but not always. So sometimes you can have a very long genre that's actually quite simple in its conventions. You can think of a journal entry, for example, is something that students might be both familiar with and something, a genre that doesn't have very complex conventions. You can write a journal entry that's 25 pages long, and it's not a complex or difficult genre to write. Whereas a strategic plan or a SWOT analysis or these more complex genres might be shorter but have very specific conventions that must be met or you have failed to write the genre. And if they have various mini and specific conventions, and that makes the genre more difficult to write. The last thing is how persnickety your audience is. This is the audience's expectations of, we'll say, perfection, okay? So an extremely picky audience will make a genre more difficult to write. And this isn't just about the conventions. Do they expect the conventions to be met perfectly or in a certain fashion? But also it has to do with the topic. So a grocery list written for yourself, quite easy to meet the needs of your audience. You're the audience. Basically, can you read your handwriting is what that comes down to. But the State of the Union address delivered to the entire Union has very complicated conventions. It also has a topic that is never going to please anyone. By definition, you can't please everyone. They have already, the opposing party has already lined up someone to speak against you before you have even delivered your talk. That's part of it. It's like, that is the situation. So you can't please that picky audience with that genre. Not possible. So, so audience persnicketiness, the last factor on how difficult a genre is. So a way to teach genres is to scaffold from within genre families, scaffold from something more familiar, easier, into something more difficult. So pick a family, say reviews, profiles, reports, and then start with a less complex and more familiar genre within that family. Students have often written book reviews. They did that, they might have done that in 5th grade, right? Read a book, review it, and then scaffold that into something more complex. A performance review, a workplace review, something that is something they've never seen before, as a final project or a final part of that portion of your semester. So your capstone becomes a complex and unfamiliar genre in the same family, okay? And because it's unfamiliar, it challenges students to teach themselves those transferable skills. And then here's an example. So something very small would be like a product review on Amazon or a book review on Goodreads, for example. Something very tiny, short, that they might have read over and over again. And then maybe a film review, and then say a book review essay, which is a more complicated type of book review that takes into account other criteria and meets different needs than, say, a shorter review that you put on Goodreads. Okay, so scaffolding through genre families can help move from the easier, say, to the more complex and difficult. Jordynn, I'll take this one, and then you'll take the last, okay?
Sure.
Okay, so another question we get is, what if I'm unfamiliar with the genre? And this is something we call teaching outside of your comfort zone. So many teachers that are new to this say, I've never written a grant proposal, like especially, say, new graduate students. Of course, the response is, you should learn. They'll give you money. It's fantastic. But that doesn't answer the question. I'm unfamiliar with this genre. How can I be expected to teach it? The answer, though, is this. You have excellent rhetorical analysis skills and literary analysis skills and all of these analysis skills that make you better at doing the things you need to do to teach this, to teach a genre. You can identify conventions better than your students can. You are good at this. You can analyze texts. You can study samples of genres and study how to write them. You're just good at it. That's why you teach this. So even though this particular text might be unfamiliar to you, it's only going to be unfamiliar to you for about 24 hours. So the example that I use is this backpacking example. You can actually pick any kind of thing. Is you have an expert backpacking guide, and that's you as the professor or instructor or graduate TA. And then you have your students, and they're novices. They don't even know how to buckle the thing. And the unfamiliar genre is the trail you've never been on before. So as the expert backpacking guide, just because you've never been on this trail before, doesn't mean you're not going to still be the expert guide. You still know how to find the landmarks, select a great place to stay for the night, build the fire, whatever needs to be done to thrive on this backpacking trip. So that is that's what it means to teach an unfamiliar genre. You can do it because your skills, you have the skills. So Jordynn, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. And I would just go back to that and add, one thing that's been useful in my experience is to not necessarily consider yourself as someone who has to have all the answers, but you're a coach. So you want your students to develop the skills that you have to analyze the genre. And to do that, you coach them. So you have them look at some samples, you ask them questions about the genre, and you try to get them to tell you, well, what do you notice about it? How is it organized? What kinds of content seem to go in the first part? What kinds of layout does it have? Does it have headings or not? You ask questions, and then students can develop answers and start to understand the genre better. And you're more like a coach and less like the person who has to have all the answers. I think we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But just as an example, here's an assignment sheet. So here's an example of an assignment that you might write that's a real-world genre, something that students might encounter later on. And the idea would be to have students writing for the Student Health Center on campus and producing fact sheets about a health problem or an illness that affects students. The one thing that tends to work really well is to have students take on a topic that's related to them in some way. So student health is a useful one. And they're writing for fellow students. So the fact sheet is something that students are going to see. So this is just an example of one kind of assignment that I've used in my class. It takes on a genre, and what we do is we go to the Student Health Center when we find a bunch of fact sheets, and if they don't have some, we find them from other sources. We look at them and say, well, what do you notice about them? How are they organized? What kinds of content are you going to need to develop? And we work closely with research librarians on campus, and they help us to identify good places to go for accessible sources that students can understand, and they write these great fact sheets. In some cases, we've actually done this as a service learning course where students have actually sent their fact sheets in to the Student Health Center. And these are materials that are that have a chance of being actually used in a real-world context. Okay, Katie, go back to you, or you muted?
You can keep going.
Okay. Okay, so one thing that you might find is that students are not comfortable being out hiking on the trail, so continue the metaphor. They want someone to tell them exactly what to do. They want someone to hold their hand and walk them down the trail. So genre pedagogy is actually a good cure for this, because the idea is not to be prescriptive and not to provide a template and just say, here's the fact sheet template, now fill it in for, you know, a stubbed toe or for a bruise or for sexually transmitted disease, whatever. You're not giving them all the answers. So you want students to learn how to ask the right questions about the genres that they're writing. So what this means is that we're trying to train them out of some of their habits, like asking me, or you as the instructor, what do you want? So how long do you want it to be? I say, well, let's look at our example fact sheets. How long are they? Should I use MLA format? Well, let's look at some fact sheets. Do they use MLA format? How do they refer to sources? So instead of what do you want, the answer becomes what do readers expect in this genre. Okay. See? I'm muted. Should I go on?
Yes, keep going.
Okay. So here's an example of a fact sheet that's, to illustrate. So this is one produced by the CDC, and we would collect a bunch of these and look at them and say, okay, what do you notice about how images are being used, about the headers that are being used, how much information is on the page, and how is it organized? And students can get a pretty good sense after looking at several of these of what a fact sheet should look like and how they can use that, those conventions that they've identified for their own situation. They're also really good at saying, you know, what's effective about this and what's ineffective. So we have a lot of fun talking about that, especially for this assignment. Okay, next slide.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That's what we have for our presentation, but we definitely have time for discussion and your questions, and we'd love to hear them.
And again, you can raise your electronic hand in the list next to your name and chat in your question. Any questions?
I can also see your questions as you type them into the question box.
Okay, so guys, I had a question that came in. In your experience, what are the greatest strengths method of teaching writing, and how do these outcomes differ from other pedagogical approaches? Are there any limitations to this approach? Did you hear that?
Yeah, actually, I didn't hear the beginning. Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. They wrote, in your experience, what are the greatest strengths of this method of writing, and how do these outcomes differ from other pedagogical approaches? Are there any limitations to this approach?
The greatest strengths are, in my experience, that students are so invested in what they're doing because they feel like they're doing something important. That is, by far and away, the biggest change I've seen. They believe in the work they're doing. They see that it's taking them someplace beyond essays for composition class. They see composition class as an important class, and so their investment, like I said, the student investment is so high. It's really makes me want to go to work. Makes them want to come to class, and that's really the most amazing thing to me. And then, of course, there's the wonderful emails that I get, and that we pulled those quotes from on that one slide. I applied for the grant and I got it. I wrote this really great some genre that I didn't teach them, and I did a great job because of what you taught me. And I get these emails from students that are in grad school writing things like I could not possibly have taught them. And so that's the greatest thing, is that I feel like they're invested in what they're learning and that they see the payback later.
We also received a question from Jill that said, how, if at all, do you approach grammar when using this approach?
Okay, so the way that I tend to approach grammar when using a genre approach is that it folds into the writing process. And as we're looking at examples of a genre, usually there's relevant stylistic or grammatical features of that genre. So, for example, in a fact sheet, there might be bulleted lists. Bulleted lists tend to use a certain kind of grammatical structure. And we might look at that when we're talking about the genre, and then when students draft their version, we go back to that and look carefully at how are their bulleted lists set up. So are they using parallel structure in their bulleted list? So I think in general, the research suggests that the best way of teaching grammar is always in context. And when you're working within a particular genre, it becomes really clear how grammar is also rhetorical. So it's going to depend on the rhetorical situation they're in, the discourse community. So if they're writing for something like a scientific fact sheet, there might be different kinds of grammatical or stylistic conventions that appear. And then we practice those and they apply them in the genre that they're writing. Oh, Katie's muted. Other questions?
Okay, there I am. Yeah, I'm back again. I have a secret, and that is that I am a huge fan of grammar, and that I've actually written 2 books on grammar, both of which though take a very strong rhetorical approach to teaching grammar, so one of the things that appealed to when working with Jordynn on this project with the genre approach is that you can't teach grammar decontextualized. It has to be within the field, at least the discipline, if not the specific genre within the discipline. And so when students say, can I use I, or can I use passive voice, or all these questions that we get about grammar, or should I use a serial comma, you say, well, what do people who write this, people who are writing this particular thing that you are writing, what are they doing? You have to study that particular, that genre, that field, to figure out their grammar and follow it. But then also emphasize, the effect of grammar on the audience that will be reading your piece, because it's not you being the grammar police, it's the people who are reading the grant proposal or the op-ed that they will submit to the college newspaper. If they turn in a piece that is incomprehensible because they failed to adhere to the journalism style guide, then it's not going to get published. And it's not because you hate them, because you hate their grammar. I mean, this is the feeling that students sometimes get with this corrective grammar. You say, look, if you want this to have the best chance of getting published, you need to learn how newspapers use grammar, and this isn't it. And then their motivation to learn grammar isn't coming from your punitive approach. It's coming from their desire to see their letter to the editor or whatever it is published, or their grant accepted, or whatever it is that you're having them write that is real, accepted by the audience that they're writing it for. So actually, this is probably the most motivating way to teach grammar that I've ever come across.
Jordynn and Katie, we have another question from Paul, who says, where do you draw the line for material being too technical and belonging in a biz tech writing class, like, for an example, an environmental impact report?
I think that's probably that will depend on your institution. For us, first year writing at UNC Chapel Hill has, the first unit is always natural sciences, and we find that some of these genres, like a policy report, are good ones to introduce students to scientific writing, because they're not as in-depth as, say, a research article or even a literature review of science, because they're written for an audience of decision makers and not scientists. But that's our institutional context. And I think the thing about the genre approach is that you can really focus it on your situation. So in our case, at a research university, students go on to do a lot of research, and we stress that in our courses. But at a different institution, I might use a different set of genres that better reflected what students are going to be writing later on in their work there, or even just the student body. So we have a lot of pre-med majors that tend to be in my classes. We don't have an engineering school at UNC, so I don't tend to do some of the genres that I would have taught when I was back at Penn State, which has a big engineering program. So I think you really have to think about your context, and then if you don't know, do some research and even just informally talk to other faculty members and see what it is that they're assigning students to write in their classes.
Hey, Katie, can you see these questions? Because we have quite a few. We have one from Allison Bartlett. How does this work in a second semester complet course focused specifically on argument?
I actually cannot see these questions. Where are they?
Okay, we'll
just read them to us. Allison's question is, yes?
How does this work in a second semester complet course focused specifically on argument?
Okay, well, first, there are genres that are driven by argument. So an op-ed or letter to the editor is a for example, argument-driven genre. So, Jordynn, what else? Help me out here.
Well, I would argue that many, if not most, genres have an argument of sorts. So, depending on the purposes of the course, I might focus mainly on public genres like the ones Katie just mentioned, or you might be interested in looking more at what kinds of arguments happen in your town around community issues. So this might be something like a recommendation report or a speech in front of, I don't know if you do oral communication, but a speech that would be in front of city council arguing for or against a certain position on an issue. That's another kind of genre. But even if it's a more academic course, a literature review makes an argument, a research paper makes an argument, a conference paper makes an argument, a grant proposal makes an argument. Almost any genre you can think of, to me, has an argument in it. So for my part, if I had a course specifically focused on argument, I would choose some genres that I thought were relevant for my students, and then focus in on how arguments get made in that genre. So how are reasons provided? How is evidence provided? What kinds of sources are used? And I think it would give students a sense of the nuance of argument as it moves across, say, an op-ed or something, and something like a recommendation report where you would see greater depth of research, or even something like a conference paper or a grant proposal.
Right. Well, this is how this works, right? So someone writes an op-ed that says that observes some public problem that can only be remedied by an administrative agency in Washington. So then the agency, then becomes a part of public discourse. And so the agency then picks up on this issue. Someone there writes a recommendation report on how to address it, and then that might, then a petition might happen that gets sent to the agency, and then the agency writes a recommendation report. Someone there is assigned this assignment, right? And so you could take a single public issue. It could be something very small. Speed limits was something that, of course, is circled around a lot. And underage drinking. These are big things that have happened in the past. But it could be something else. I can't think of something off the top of my head except for something that has been happening in the news lately, which is about how student medical records are treated on campus, for example. And so, so it starts with an op-ed, and then there's a petition, and then people write public letters, and then it hits Congress, and then suddenly there's a white paper or a recommendation report. And these are all specific genres that students might be a part of writing, because the people who write those white papers and recommendation reports are actually, those are outsourced to think tanks, academics, people like that, and not necessarily career people in Washington. So these are genres that you can assign your students to write with one topic, a single arc of topic across the course. That actually sounds really fun to me. And that would be a great second semester course, because they already have these, the discovery skills. Now you can focus on the different types of research that's required for the different types of documents, the different types of citation required for the different types of documents, things like that.
Jordynn and Katie, we have another question from Lynn Summer, who asks, how might this approach work at a two-year college with a number of underprepared students whose writing skills are initially very weak?
Could you repeat the question? I don't think I could hear it.
That was very quiet.
At a two-year college with a number of underprepared students whose writing skills are initially very weak.
Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, okay, the thing is about underprepared students, if the underpreparedness stems from, say, weak, we would call weak writing skills based on the question, that does not mean they haven't encountered these genres. They haven't encountered genres in their everyday life. They still have genres that they are familiar with. And it's likely that you might even you might even know what they are. They might even be the same genres. So the issue is more of one of maybe pace rather than one of approach. So this is where we go back to that, this idea of familiarity, complexity, and audience persnicketiness. And you can again scaffold appropriately, but this approach is actually one that is I feel just right on target for working with underprepared students, because it is very empowering. These are students that have been, in my experience, I taught at a school that had many first first in their family college students. And so this is very empowering. So it says, you are the one, you are in command of your you know, of your writing, and so they know by the time they finish that they're able to teach themselves how to do this. They don't have that. It's not someone from above either commanding them or beating them down, and it's so because of its empowering nature, I find it's excellent for teaching students that might not have been prepared in the traditional way for college.
And again, I would think about just the institutional context. So what genres are they familiar with? And it might be popular genres as well. So you might think about a film review on Rotten Tomatoes, or and then build up from there. Especially thinking about what kinds of writing they're going to encounter either in college or what kinds of careers they're preparing for. So some two-year colleges are kind of more career-oriented, and students might be encountering some of the genres that we mentioned earlier, like a resume or a performance review or something like that seem kind of like business genres. Or you could go in the direction of popular genres, or if it's the kind of program where students are kind of prepping to transition into a four-year college, you might focus more on academic genres. But I think it works either way. And I think it helps to demystify writing, because the essay as a genre or a kind of school genre seems so rule-driven and kind of arbitrary sometimes to students when they don't understand how to work well within that genre. And when they don't have the investment in that genre that they might have with something that they can easily identify in the real world. Okay, there's another question, Carrie says, from...
Yes, from Brenna Siegel-Feiner. Hope I pronounced that correctly. I train TAs to teach this way using a genre approach, but I am often met with resistance. They worry that students won't be prepared to write in some classes where writing is taught in a more traditional way, where students will have to write a traditional research paper or essays. I often struggle to respond to that concern, even though I do explain the transfer of the skill theories behind teaching with the genres. How do you respond to concerns like this?
Well, this is one of the things that I encounter, honestly, as well. The TAs that I train are they're almost all English majors. They have gotten where they are because they do very well at the traditional essay or research paper, and they cling to that. One of the things that we've been doing here is actually to reach out to faculty. So we've been interviewing faculty and talking to them, and gradually trying to help them identify ways that they can teach more realistic genres, because they're almost, the faculty who sign traditional essays and research papers are almost always disappointed with how they turn out. So there's a mismatch between whatever they're doing in class and the kinds of writing that their students produce. So that's one thing that we've been doing, and as we see that spread throughout the university, we're getting more investment on the part of our TAs. But the other thing that I show them is the data from the genre project, and I say, look, we're not just preparing students to go on and do well in a literature class, but these are all the kinds of genres that they're going to encounter later on, and they're not just essays and research papers. And then the final thing is, it's useful for students to be able to figure out when an instructor says research paper, what they mean, and there's kind of a code that you might see in assignment descriptions. So one thing I do with TFs and also with my first-year students is I pull up assignment descriptions that I found from across campus, and I say, look, this says research paper, but it's asking you to go do an original observation and report the results. So that's really more like a research article or a conference article or a conference paper. Or there might be one where the assignment is to go study existing literature on a topic. That's really a literature review, and that's a genre that we often discuss in one of my classes. So I try to empower the students to be able to look at something that seems like, often when professors assign something, an essay or a research paper, what they really have in mind is a genre that they write. They're just not calling it that. I hope that makes sense. So they're calling it a research paper, but it's really more like a research article that they would write as a scholar. Other questions?
Hi, this is Carrie. We have a couple of questions, and we're about out of time. Jessica says, past, I have also had students with grammar columns in the style of Grammar Girl and June Casagrande, I don't know her, for each other. And I then published them for our class on our course webpage. Her question is, an assignment like the fact sheet seems to me like it would be easy for students to plagiarize. How do you handle this issue?
Well, I always try to give them a really specific local context. Sorry, I have feedback again. I apologize. And then we do so much process work that they're always handing in a partial draft or some invention exercises that we're doing, and they're posting their work on our course management system. So I never just get a completed assignment that I haven't seen through all those different stages. And then usually if there is the odd one that slips through, I'll say, okay, this fact sheet, it will stand out because it doesn't seem like it's written for students at our university. This seems like something that was written for some other place or that was, posted online. It's almost always the case that I can pick it out really easily, but when you combine genre with process, it's actually really rare. I haven't had a single plagiarism case that I've identified in my classes since I've been doing this, and I think it's partially the combination of the unique rhetorical situation and then embedding it in a process approach. Katie, do you have ideas on that?
If you walk students through each stage of the process. Right, so if you walk students through each stage of the process, who are you going to create this for? I mean, this is a fact sheet that doesn't exist except for you. What is the problem that you uniquely have identified on our campus that you are going to create a fact sheet for that doesn't exist, can't possibly, because it's here. The situation is unique to you and this place. It isn't something that, and then of course you walk them through each phase of the process. They're designing them in class. You're watching them do it. Yes, it's the idea of combining process with genre theory and genre pedagogy does seem to prevent it. The plagiarism I've encountered has been last minute, people with poor time management, and then as soon as I look at them funny, they're like, yeah, I did it. And then, of course, they feel terrible. And it's because they waited till the last minute.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Any other questions that are unanswered the authors can get back to? This is from Veronica.
I want to say,
yes?
I was going to say, our Twitter handles are on the bottom of this slide under the title. So we're both on Twitter. If you want to hop on, you can always chat with us about teaching writing and rhetoric, and we'll be at 4Cs. Not talking, well, no, she'll be talking about genre. I won't be, but we'll be there. We'll be tweeting there a lot, probably, in very silly fashion. So if you're going to be at 4Cs, you should come and track us down. So you can always, if you want to continue genre conversations that way, that's a fun way to do it.
Okay, can I throw you guys one last question?
Sure.
From Veronica again. My institution, we use themes to organize our first-year composition courses. Do you have recommendations for how to layer this genre-based approach on a theme-based approach?
So the question was about how to layer a genre-based approach with a themed approach. And I actually really like that approach. It's something that a lot of the TAs in our program use really successfully. We also have in our program the added layer of writing in the discipline. So the answer I'll give will, sorry, keep getting muted. An example would be students have used the topic of food, and they might have students write something like an ethnographic report about a food custom in our community or in their own family, and then they might, trying to think of other genres they might write,
they might, you could compose a profile article of a particular person, but also a place. They could do a review of a restaurant. I know another faculty member in my department does that assignment quite regularly, where students study the genre of the food review or the restaurant review, and the instructor is actually a restaurant critic himself. So I think there's a lot you can do with themes, and it tends to work really well because they build up expertise over the course of the semester in that particular topic or theme. I've done courses on risk because we have kind of a science component in our curriculum. We would start with something like a literature review about a particular risk, like genetically modified foods or BPA, and then they would write a recommendation report, and then they would write something to a public audience, like maybe a fact sheet about the risk that they were studying. So I'm all for themes. I think they're fabulous.
I agree. The theme approach actually, in my opinion, lowers the cognitive load on our students. They don't have to come up with a new topic for every genre that they write. So the topic stays the same, that's a constant, and then the genres change. So it's one less thing they have to think of, and that's like I said, it lightens their load. So I think it's a really great idea, actually.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap it up. A couple minutes over. I apologize for the slight echoing in the background. And my cat is now starting to yowl. So I think it's this lovely webinar. Thanks everybody for attending. We have your if we have not answered them, we'll make sure to get you an answer. I really appreciate you attending, and look for more of these webinars coming up in the future. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jordynn. The weather in Tampa, Jordynn, nice?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
All right. Great. Have a good weekend, and again, thanks for attending. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.